The emergency broadcast crackled through the static one final time before dying into silence, leaving Kestra Valdez staring at the dead radio with trembling hands. Outside the reinforced windows of the communications tower, the city of New Haven burned in patches of orange and red, smoke columns rising like funeral pyres against the dawn sky. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the radio console, her breath fogging the surface as the weight of isolation settled over her shoulders like a burial shroud. 3 weeks had passed since the first reports of the infected began filtering through the emergency channels. 3 weeks since ordinary people started turning into something else entirely, something that hungered for human flesh with an insatiable appetite that defied all logic and science. Kestra had maintained her post at the radio station, broadcasting emergency coordinates and safe zone locations until, one by one, every safe zone had fallen silent. Now she was the last voice crying out into the void, and even that voice was about to be extinguished. The generator rumbled beneath her feet, its fuel gauge hovering dangerously close to empty. She had maybe 6 hours of power left, perhaps 8 if she rationed carefully. After that, the tower would go dark, and her ability to reach any remaining survivors would vanish completely. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had spent her entire career connecting people across vast distances, would die alone and unheard. A metallic bang echoed from the stairwell below, followed by the distinctive shuffling sound that had become the soundtrack to humanity's downfall. Kestra's hand instinctively moved to the pistol holstered at her hip, her fingers wrapping around the grip with practiced ease. She had learned to shoot in the past weeks out of necessity, her accuracy improving with each desperate encounter. The infected had found her tower. She moved to the window and peered down at the base of the structure. A crowd of them pressed against the entrance, their gray skin mottled with decay, their eyes clouded white with death. Among them, she recognized faces from her neighborhood, people she had bought coffee from, waved to in passing, shared small talk with about the weather. Mrs. Chin from the flower shop stood among them, her floral apron now stained with blood and torn to ribbons, her mouth hanging open in a permanent silent scream. The sight should have filled Kestra with horror, but instead she felt only a deep, aching sadness. These weren't monsters, not really. They were victims of something far worse than death, trapped in bodies that no longer belonged to them, driven by urges they couldn't control or understand. The real monsters were the ones who had caused this plague, the shadowy figures in laboratories and government facilities who had played with forces beyond their comprehension. As if responding to her thoughts, movement caught her eye on the horizon. A convoy of black vehicles was making its way through the abandoned streets, moving with purpose and coordination that spoke of military organization. Hope flared in her chest like a struck match. Someone was still fighting. Someone still had the resources and will to mount a resistance against the tide of undead that had swallowed civilization. She rushed back to the radio, her fingers flying over the controls as she powered up the transmitter for what might be the last time. "This is Emergency Broadcast Station 77 Alpha," she spoke into the microphone, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting below as the infected began to break through the tower's defenses. "I have visual confirmation of organized resistance forces moving through Sector 12. If anyone is receiving this transmission, there is still hope. Do not give up. Do not surrender. Fight for every breath, fight for every heartbeat, because somewhere out there, others are fighting too." The sound of splintering wood echoed from below, followed by the terrible moaning chorus of the undead as they flooded into the tower. Kestra gripped the microphone tighter, knowing these would be her final words to a world that might no longer be listening. "This is Kestra Valdez, signing off. May we meet again in whatever comes after this darkness. Stay strong, stay human, and never stop fighting for tomorrow." 12 feet beneath the burning streets, Thane Okafor pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned subway tunnel and counted his remaining ammunition. 15 rounds in the clip, 3 spare magazines, and a combat knife that had seen more action in the past month than in his entire previous military career. The irony of seeking refuge in the underground, in the very tunnels that had once carried millions of people to their daily lives, wasn't lost on him. The group of survivors huddled around a small fire made from burning newspaper and debris numbered 23 souls, down from 42 just a week ago. Among them were Zara Nakamura, a pediatric surgeon whose hands had saved countless children but now trembled as she cleaned makeshift weapons. Joaquin Marquez, a construction foreman whose knowledge of the city's infrastructure had kept them alive through 3 major infected swarms. And little Ember Cho, 8 years old and clutching a stuffed elephant that had somehow remained pristine despite the apocalypse surrounding them. Thane's trained eyes swept over his charges, cataloging injuries, stress levels, and the subtle signs of psychological breakdown that preceded either complete collapse or transformation into something useful for survival. Zara showed the telltale signs of surgeon's focus under pressure, her movements economical and precise even when performing mundane tasks. Joaquin carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who understood structural integrity, both in buildings and in human communities. But it was Ember who worried him most, not because she was weak, but because she was adapting too well to their new reality. The northern tunnel connects to the old maintenance shafts, Joaquin was saying, his weathered finger tracing routes on a hand-drawn map spread across an overturned crate. We could reach the hospital district without going topside, but we'd have to go through the flooded section near Grand Central. He paused, his expression grim. Last time anyone checked, that area was crawling with infected who'd fallen through the street gratings. Zara looked up from the medical supplies she was inventorying, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. We need those antibiotics. Marcus won't last another day without treatment, and Sarah's infection is spreading faster than I can control with what we have. She gestured toward two figures lying on makeshift stretchers, their labored breathing echoing off the tunnel walls. If we're going to move them, it needs to be tonight. Thane nodded, understanding the impossible mathematics of survival that governed their every decision. Risk the lives of 23 to save 2, or sacrifice the 2 to preserve the many. In his former life as a Marine, such calculations had been theoretical exercises in ethics classes. Here in the tunnels, they were daily realities that carved pieces from his soul with each choice. A distant rumbling echoed through the tunnels, different from the usual settling sounds of the old subway system. Thane held up his hand for silence, and the group immediately froze, their faces turning toward him with the instinctive trust that had developed between them. The sound came again, rhythmic and mechanical, accompanied by the faint smell of diesel exhaust. Vehicles, whispered Chin Okafor, Thane's younger brother who had found them 2 weeks ago after escaping from a collapsed safe zone. Moving fast, maybe 3 or 4 blocks north of us. His face, so similar to Thane's but unmarked by military service, showed a mixture of hope and fear that had become the default expression of survival. Ember shifted closer to Zara, her small hand finding the surgeon's arm. Are they the good guys or the bad guys? She asked in a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any adult's question. In her 8-year-old worldview, the distinction was still clear-cut, unlike the adults who had learned that in this new world, the line between hero and villain had become impossibly blurred. Thane moved to the tunnel entrance, his rifle held ready as he peered into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. The sound of engines was growing louder, and with it came something else. The distant chatter of radio communications, too faint to make out individual words but carrying the unmistakable cadence of military coordination. Someone was still organized enough to maintain radio discipline and convoy protocols. Pack everything, he ordered quietly, his decision made. We're moving toward the sound. If it's military, they might have resources we need. If it's raiders, we need to know their position to avoid them. He looked back at his group, these people who had become his responsibility and his family. Either way, staying here isn't an option anymore. The infected are getting more aggressive, more coordinated. It's only a matter of time before they find our entrance. As the group began their practiced evacuation routine, each person knowing exactly what to carry and where to move, Thane allowed himself a moment of something that might have been hope. Somewhere above them, engines roared with purpose, and for the first time in weeks, he dared to believe that they might not be the last organized humans left in the city. The convoy's lead vehicle ground to a halt in front of the gutted remains of St. Mary's Hospital, its armored plating scarred by countless encounters with both infected and desperate humans. Colonel Astrid Volkov stepped out into the morning light, her boots crunching on broken glass and debris that carpeted the street like a crystal graveyard. Behind her, 12 vehicles disgorged soldiers and civilian specialists, their movements efficient and coordinated despite the exhaustion etched into every face. Dr. Raven Blackwood emerged from the medical transport, her pristine laboratory coat a stark contrast to the wasteland surrounding them. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed science could still solve the world's problems, even as the evidence of science's failures shambled through the streets around them. Her research team followed, lugging equipment cases that contained humanity's latest attempt to understand and combat the plague that had transformed civilization into a hunting ground. The hospital's main structure appears intact, reported Sergeant Mesa Beaumont, her sniper rifle already scanning the upper floors for movement. But thermal imaging shows significant heat signatures in the basement levels. Could be survivors, could be a nest of infected. Without going in, there's no way to tell. Her voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who had learned to compartmentalize horror as a survival mechanism. Astrid studied the building through her binoculars, noting the barricaded windows and the defensive positions that had been hastily constructed from hospital equipment. Someone had tried to make a stand here, and the question was whether they had succeeded or simply delayed the inevitable. The silence was almost worse than the moaning of infected. It suggested either total victory or total defeat, with no middle ground. "We need those medical supplies," Dr. Blackwood said, adjusting her glasses as she consulted a tablet displaying building schematics. "The pharmacy and surgical equipment stores are on the 3rd floor. If we can secure them, we'll have enough antibiotics and surgical supplies to treat a significant population." She paused, her expression betraying a flicker of something that might have been guilt. "My research requires test subjects, both infected and healthy controls. If there are survivors inside, they could volunteer for the trials." The word volunteer hung in the air like a curse, and several of the soldiers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the ethics of survival in their new world. Astrid had seen too much to be shocked by the compromises they all made, but something in Dr. Blackwood's tone suggested that the line between research and exploitation had already been crossed, perhaps repeatedly. A movement in one of the upper windows caught Mesa's attention, and she adjusted her scope for a better view. "I've got confirmed human activity, 3rd floor northwest corner. Single individual appears to be signaling." She paused, her training warring with something more human in her voice. "It looks like a child, Colonel. Maybe 10 or 11 years old." The implications hit the group like a physical blow. A child survivor meant adults who had protected them, adults who might still be alive but trapped. It also meant difficult decisions about resources, about who could be saved and who would have to be sacrificed for the greater good. Astrid had made such decisions before, and each one had carved away another piece of the person she had been before the world ended. 2 teams, Astrid decided, her voice carrying the weight of command. "Mesa, take point with Alpha Team and secure the medical supplies. Avoid contact with any survivors until we can assess the situation. Bravo Team comes with me to investigate the basement signatures." She turned to Dr. Blackwood, her expression hardening. "Your research will have to wait. We extract supplies and survivors in that order." As they prepared to enter the hospital, a distant sound echoed through the empty streets. A radio transmission, faint but clear enough to make out words. Someone was broadcasting emergency coordinates, a lone voice calling out to anyone who might be listening. The transmission sparked something in each of them, a reminder that they were not the only ones still fighting, still hoping, still human enough to reach out across the darkness. The hospital doors loomed before them, their glass panels spider-webbed with cracks but still intact. Beyond those doors lay either salvation or damnation, and possibly both. Astrid checked her weapon one final time, knowing that whatever they found inside would test not just their survival skills, but their humanity itself. In a world where the line between civilization and savagery grew thinner each day, every choice carried the weight of who they would become in the aftermath. Part 4, Echoes in the Dark. The hospital's basement corridors stretched before them like the intestines of some massive, dying creature, lit only by the flickering emergency lighting that somehow still functioned despite the chaos above. Astrid's team moved in standard formation, their weapons trained on shadows that might conceal either infected or desperate survivors. The air hung thick with the smell of antiseptic mixed with decay, a combination that spoke of medical efforts that had ultimately failed to stem the tide of transformation. Behind them, Dr. Blackwood's equipment hummed softly as it analyzed air samples and recorded ambient temperature variations. Her scientific detachment grated against the soldiers' heightened awareness, but Astrid recognized the coping mechanism for what it was. Some people fought the horror with weapons, others with denial, and still others with the comforting illusion that understanding could lead to control. "Movement ahead," whispered Corporal Darius Kane, his hand signals indicating multiple contacts around the next corner. The thermal imaging had been accurate. The basement levels were indeed occupied, but by what remained to be seen. The sound of shuffling feet mixed with something else, something that might have been weeping or might have been the wind through broken ventilation systems. As they rounded the corner, the scene that greeted them defied easy categorization. A group of hospital staff and patients had barricaded themselves in the main surgery suite, creating a makeshift fortress of medical equipment and furniture. But these weren't the mindless infected they had expected to find. These were people in various stages of transformation, some still lucid enough to recognize the soldiers as human, others lost to whatever force drove the infected but somehow contained by the barricades their still-thinking companions had erected. Dr. Helena Vasquez, still wearing her surgeon's scrubs despite weeks of captivity, approached the barricade with movements that were almost normal, almost human. Her skin showed the telltale grayish pallor of early infection, but her eyes retained a spark of intelligence that made Astrid's finger hesitate on her weapon's trigger. Behind Dr. Vasquez, other figures moved in the shadows, some sitting quietly against walls, others pacing with the restless energy that preceded full transformation. "Please," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice carrying only the slightest slur that marked her condition. "We've been waiting for someone to find us. We need help, but not the kind you're probably thinking of offering." She gestured to her companions, her movements careful and deliberate. "We're infected, but we're still ourselves, at least partially. We've been studying our own condition, trying to understand what's happening to us." Dr. Blackwood pushed forward, her scientific curiosity overriding protocol and basic caution. "Impossible. The infection causes complete neural degradation within 72 hours. You can't maintain cognitive function and rational thought while infected." Her equipment began taking readings, beeping softly as it analyzed the air around the barricaded survivors. "That's what we thought too," Dr. Vasquez replied, a bitter smile crossing her features. "But we've been here for 3 weeks and some of us are still capable of complex thought, of planning, of remembering who we were. We think it has something to do with adrenaline levels during initial infection, or possibly pre-existing medical conditions. The virus affects everyone differently." Astrid felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, not physically but conceptually. Everything they thought they knew about the infected, about the plague that had destroyed civilization, was being challenged by these impossible survivors. If some infected could retain their humanity, what did that mean for their strategies, their goals, their very definition of enemy and ally? "We need to leave this place," Dr. Vasquez continued, her words becoming slightly more slurred as emotion overtook her careful control. "The others, the ones who are fully turned, they're drawn to us. They know we're different and it drives them into feeding frenzies. We've been fighting them off, but our barricades won't hold much longer." As if summoned by her words, a terrible howling echoed through the hospital's upper floors, followed by the sound of running feet and something heavy being dragged across floors. The fully infected had found their scent and they were coming. Astrid's team immediately shifted into defensive positions, their training taking over even as their minds struggled to process the implications of what they had discovered. "We extract them all," Astrid decided, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Infected or not, they're still people, and they might be the key to understanding this plague." She turned to Dr. Blackwood, whose equipment was now registering readings that made her eyes widen with something between excitement and terror. "Can your research use subjects who are partially infected?" The answer came not in words but in the form of dozens of infected bursting through the hospital's main floor above them, their inhuman shrieks echoing down the stairwells like the cries of demons. The time for questions had ended. Now came the time for impossible choices and desperate action. Part 5. The Underground War. The subway tunnels had become Thane's battlefield, a subterranean maze where the rules of conventional warfare no longer applied. His group had grown to 37 survivors after linking up with Dr. Vasquez's partial infected research team, creating a community that challenged every assumption about friend and enemy in their new world. The tunnel they had claimed as their base stretched for nearly a quarter mile, with defensive positions carved from rubble and reinforced with salvaged materials. Zara worked tirelessly in their makeshift medical bay, treating both fully human survivors and the partially infected with equal dedication. Her surgical skills had adapted to their limited resources, and she had learned to work by candlelight when necessary. The partially infected presented unique challenges. Their wounds healed differently, their bodies responding to medications in unexpected ways, but they remained people, capable of gratitude and fear and hope. "The northern sectors are completely overrun," reported Joaquin as he updated their hand-drawn maps with information gathered from scouting expeditions. "But the infected seem to be avoiding the areas where our partial infected team members have been. Dr. Vasquez thinks it's because their scent confuses the fully turned ones." His weathered hands traced routes through their underground kingdom, marking safe passages and areas of high danger. Ember had become something of a mascot for the group, her presence reminding them all of what they were fighting to preserve. She moved easily between the fully human survivors and the partially infected, showing none of the fear or revulsion that still affected some of the adults. Her innocence served as a bridge between two groups that might otherwise have viewed each other with suspicion. Dr. Vasquez sat in the corner of their main chamber, her condition having stabilized at a point somewhere between human and infected. She retained her intelligence and personality, but her physical needs had changed in ways that challenged the group's resources and ethics. She required fresh meat to maintain her cognitive function, a need that forced them to make decisions about hunting in a world where prey was scarce and dangerous. The Colonel's convoy passed through Sector 7 again yesterday, Chin reported, his young face showing the premature aging that had marked all their faces. Same route, same timing. They're running regular patrols, which means they have a base somewhere to the east. His observations had proven invaluable for avoiding both military forces and infected swarms. Thane nodded, considering their options. The military presence represented both opportunity and danger. Resources, protection, and the possibility of evacuation to a secure zone balanced against the risk of being separated, studied, or worse. He had seen enough of human nature in crisis to know that survival often brought out the worst in people, even those who claimed to represent order and civilization. We need to make contact, he decided, his voice carrying the weight of command that the group had gradually accepted. But on our terms, not theirs. If they have resources and we have information they need, maybe we can find common ground. He looked around the circle of faces illuminated by their small fire, seeing trust and fear in equal measure. Dr. Blackwood's research had become a constant presence in their discussions, even though none of them had met her directly. Her work represented hope for a cure, but also the terrifying possibility of being treated as test subjects rather than people. The partially infected members of their group were particularly vulnerable to being viewed as valuable research material rather than individuals with rights and dignity. A distant explosion echoed through the tunnels, followed by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. Someone was fighting a major engagement somewhere above them, and the intensity suggested it was more than just a routine infected encounter. The sound pattern indicated military weapons and tactics, which meant the Colonel's forces were engaged in serious combat. Surface reconnaissance, Thane ordered, selecting his most experienced scouts. I want to know what's happening up there and whether it affects our position down here. He turned to Dr. Vasquez, whose enhanced senses might prove valuable. Can you detect anything from the infected in this area? Changes in behavior, movement patterns? Dr. Vasquez closed her eyes, her face taking on the concentrated expression that had become familiar when she accessed her infected abilities. They're agitated, moving in larger groups than usual. Something has them stirred up, something big. She opened her eyes, and for a moment they flickered with an inhuman gleam before returning to their normal brown. And they're all moving in the same direction, toward Sector 7. The implications hit the group like a physical blow. Sector 7 was where the military convoy had been conducting regular patrols. If the infected were massing in that area, it meant either the military was under siege or they had found something that was drawing the infected like a magnet. Either way, it represented a shift in the balance of power that could affect everyone's survival. As Thane prepared his scouts for what might be a suicide mission to the surface, he couldn't shake the feeling that their small underground community was about to be swept up in something much larger than their daily struggle for survival. The war between the living and the dead was escalating, and soon there would be no safe tunnels left to hide in. Part 6. The Research Station. Colonel Astrid Volkov stood in the command center of their mobile research facility, watching monitors that displayed feeds from across the city's infected zones. The facility, a collection of connected vehicles and portable structures, represented the last organized attempt to study and combat the plague that had consumed civilization. Dr. Blackwood's research had yielded both promising results and terrifying implications, creating as many questions as it answered. The partially infected subjects they had rescued from the hospital had proven invaluable to the research effort, but their cooperation came at an ethical cost that weighed heavily on everyone involved. These were people who retained their memories, their personalities, their capacity for suffering, yet they were also the key to understanding how the infection operated and potentially how it could be stopped. The latest blood work confirms it, Dr. Blackwood announced, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and exhaustion. The partially infected maintain a unique antibody structure that allows them to resist full transformation while retaining some enhanced physical capabilities. If we can isolate and synthesize these antibodies, we might be able to create both a vaccine and a treatment for early-stage infection. Mesa watched the perimeter through her rifle scope, her attention divided between the scientific discussions and the growing number of infected that seemed drawn to their location. The research activities had created electromagnetic signatures and scent trails that attracted unwanted attention, forcing them to relocate their position every few days to avoid being overrun. The problem is replication, Dr. Blackwood continued, her hands moving over her equipment with practiced efficiency. The antibodies seem to be tied to specific genetic markers, and our attempts to culture them artificially have failed. We need more subjects, both partially infected and fully human, to understand the mechanism." Her words carried implications that made several of the soldiers exchange uncomfortable glances. Dr. Vasquez, who had volunteered to serve as both subject and consultant, looked up from the medical data she was reviewing. Her condition had stabilized, but her appearance continued to change in subtle ways that reminded everyone of her uncertain status between human and infected. "There's something else you need to consider," she said quietly. "The partially infected aren't just resistant to full transformation. We're developing new capabilities, enhanced senses, increased strength and speed. But we're also becoming something different, something that might not be entirely human anymore." The weight of her words settled over the group like a shroud. The research that might save humanity could also represent the next step in human evolution, a forced adaptation to a world where traditional humanity could no longer survive. The ethical implications were staggering, touching on questions of identity, consent, and the very definition of what it meant to be human. Sergeant Beaumont's voice crackled over the radio from her position on the perimeter. "Colonel, we've got movement in the subway access points. Large group emerging from the tunnels, mixed human and infected signatures. They're approaching under a white flag." Her professional calm couldn't entirely mask the tension in her voice. Astrid moved to the observation platform, her binoculars revealing a group of survivors led by a tall man with military bearing. Among them were both normal humans and individuals who showed signs of partial infection, creating a community that mirrored their own research group in disturbing ways. The sight suggested that their situation wasn't unique, that other groups had also discovered the possibility of coexistence between different stages of infection. "Let them approach, but maintain defensive positions," Astrid ordered, her mind racing through the implications of this encounter. Another group of survivors meant potential allies, additional research subjects, and competition for limited resources. It also meant witnesses to their research activities, people who might have different ideas about the ethics of survival and the acceptable costs of seeking a cure. As the group drew closer, Astrid could see children among them, including a young girl who walked confidently between humans and partially infected as if such arrangements were perfectly natural. The sight stirred something in her that she had thought the apocalypse had killed, a recognition that innocence could still exist even in their transformed world. Dr. Blackwood was already preparing her equipment for new subjects, her scientific excitement overriding the human drama unfolding before them. "This is perfect," she murmured, adjusting her instruments. "A control group that has developed independently of our research. We can compare their adaptation patterns with our subjects and possibly identify the factors that determine successful partial infection versus full transformation." The approaching survivors halted at the edge of their camp's perimeter, their leader stepping forward with his hands visible and empty. His voice carried across the distance with military precision. "I'm Thane Okafor, representing a community of 37 survivors. We've been monitoring your activities and would like to discuss mutual cooperation." He paused, his gaze taking in their research setup and the mixed nature of their own group. "We have information you need and you have resources we could use. But we do this as equals, not as subjects and researchers." The line had been drawn in the wasteland between their two communities, and Astrid realized that the next few minutes would determine whether they would face the future as allies or enemies. In a world where humanity was an endangered species, every choice carried the weight of potential extinction or evolution. Part 7, The Convergence. The meeting between the two groups took place in neutral ground, an abandoned church whose broken stained glass windows cast fractured rainbows across the debris-strewn floor. Thane faced Colonel Volkov across a makeshift table constructed from fallen pews, while their respective communities maintained defensive positions outside. The presence of partially infected individuals in both groups had created an unprecedented situation, a negotiation between two communities that challenged traditional definitions of human and inhuman. Dr. Blackwood could barely contain her excitement as she observed the interactions between the different partially infected individuals. Her equipment recorded everything from pheromone levels to behavioral patterns, creating a database that might finally unlock the secrets of controlled infection. But her scientific objectivity was balanced by Dr. Vasquez and the other partially infected, who insisted on being treated as consultants rather than subjects. "The research has potential," Thane acknowledged, reviewing the data that Dr. Blackwood had shared. "But the ethical implications are staggering. You're talking about deliberately infecting people, even if the goal is to create controlled partial infection. That's a line that can't be uncrossed." His military background gave him a framework for assessing risk and benefit, but this situation pushed beyond any training he had received. Zara examined the medical facilities that the Colonel's group had established, her surgeon's eye cataloging equipment and supplies that could save lives in their underground community. But she also saw the research apparatus, the containment facilities, and the clinical detachment with which some of the subjects were being treated. The line between healing and experimentation had blurred beyond recognition. The infected masses are growing more organized, reported Mesa from her observation post, her sniper scope trained on movement in the distance. Large groups moving with coordination, almost like they're being directed by something or someone. Her words sent a chill through both groups, suggesting that their debates about ethics and cooperation might be rendered moot by events beyond their control. Ember had gravitated toward the other children in both groups, creating an instant community that ignored the divisions and fears that still affected many of the adults. Her easy acceptance of the partially infected served as a reminder that adaptation might be easier for those who hadn't lived long enough to develop rigid expectations about what normal looked like. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, her enhanced senses detecting patterns that escaped normal human perception. "The infected aren't just becoming more organized. They're evolving, developing new capabilities and behaviors. What we're seeing now might just be the beginning of something much more significant." Her words carried the weight of someone who existed between worlds, observing changes that others couldn't perceive. The discussion was interrupted by urgent radio chatter from both groups' perimeter guards. Multiple contacts approaching from different directions, moving fast and with obvious purpose. The infected had found their meeting place, drawn by the concentration of sense and electromagnetic signatures from their combined presence. Defensive positions, both Thane and Astrid ordered simultaneously, their leadership instincts overriding the tensions between their groups. The partially infected members of both communities immediately moved to support the defense, their enhanced abilities proving invaluable as scouts and early warning systems. Dr. Blackwood's equipment registered the approaching infected horde, her readings showing numbers that dwarfed anything they had encountered before. "Thermal imaging shows over 200 contacts, approaching from 3 directions," she reported, her scientific comm cracking slightly under the magnitude of the threat. "They're moving in coordinated waves like a military assault." The attack, when it came, was unlike anything either group had experienced. The infected moved with tactical awareness, using cover and coordinated rushes that suggested either retained military training or learned behavior passed between individuals. The partially infected defenders fought alongside their fully human companions, their enhanced abilities crucial to the defense but also a stark reminder of how the line between human and inhuman continued to blur. As the battle raged around the church, both communities realized that their philosophical debates about ethics and evolution had become academic questions. Survival required cooperation, adaptation, and the acceptance that their world had changed beyond any possibility of return to previous normalcy. The future, if they had one, would be built by communities that could bridge the gap between human and post-human, between the world that was and the world that was becoming. In the midst of chaos and violence, a new alliance was being forged, tempered by shared struggle and mutual dependence. But even as they fought side by side, each person carried the knowledge that they were participating in the transformation of humanity itself, witnesses to the end of one evolutionary chapter and the beginning of another. Part 8. What Remains. 6 months after the convergence, the underground city that had grown beneath New Haven's ruins housed nearly 300 survivors, representing the largest known community of both human and partially infected individuals. The subway tunnels had been expanded into a complex network of living spaces, workshops, medical facilities and research laboratories, creating a society that would have been unimaginable before the plague transformed the world. Kestra Valdez's voice still echoed through the tunnels each evening, but now she broadcast hope instead of desperation. Her radio equipment, powered by an ingenious combination of solar panels and bicycle generators, maintained contact with 17 other survivor communities across the continent. The network she had helped establish was slowly rebuilding the connections that held civilization together, one transmission at a time. Dr. Blackwood's research had yielded a treatment that could slow and sometimes halt the progression of infection, but her greatest discovery was that evolution itself had found a solution. The partially infected represented a new branch of humanity, adapted to survive in a world where the old rules no longer applied. Her work now focused on understanding this adaptation rather than trying to reverse it. Thane and Astrid had merged their leadership styles into something that worked for their unique community, balancing military efficiency with democratic decision-making. Their compound had become a model for other survivor groups, demonstrating that cooperation between different types of post-plague humanity was not only possible but essential for long-term survival. The fully infected still roamed the surface world, but their behavior had continued to evolve. Some groups had developed primitive tool use and basic communication, suggesting that even complete transformation didn't necessarily mean the end of intelligence. The relationship between the surface infected and the underground communities remained tense but had settled into a kind of cold war punctuated by occasional truces and trading of resources. Ember, now 9 years old, represented the first generation to grow up in the post-plague world. She moved effortlessly between fully human, partially infected, and even some of the more evolved surface infected, serving as a translator and mediator for communications that the adults still found difficult. Her childhood had been shaped by adaptation and acceptance, making her perhaps the first true citizen of the new world. Zara's medical practice had evolved to include treatments and procedures that would have been considered impossible before the plague. She worked with patients whose biology had been fundamentally altered, developing new surgical techniques and medical understanding that pushed the boundaries of traditional medicine. Her work saved lives across the spectrum of posthuman conditions. As winter approached, the underground city prepared for its first major seasonal challenge. Food storage, heating, and the psychological effects of extended underground living all presented obstacles that required innovative solutions. But the community had learned to face challenges together, drawing strength from their diversity rather than being divided by it. Dr. Vasquez stood in the central chamber, her condition now stable for over 4 months. She had become the unofficial ambassador between the human and partially infected populations, her unique perspective invaluable for resolving conflicts and misunderstandings. Her medical knowledge, enhanced by her transformed physiology, had contributed to breakthroughs that purely human researchers couldn't have achieved. The children of the community had adapted fastest to their new reality, forming friendships and relationships that ignored the biological boundaries that still sometimes troubled the adults. They played games that incorporated the enhanced abilities of their partially infected friends, creating new forms of entertainment and social interaction that belonged entirely to their post-plague world. Mesa maintained her position as head of security, but her role had evolved beyond simple perimeter defense. She now coordinated with surface-infected groups that had proven capable of communication, establishing protocols for resource sharing and territorial agreements. Her sniper skills had saved the community countless times, but her diplomatic abilities might prove even more valuable for their long-term survival. The radio crackled to life in Kestra's communication center, carrying a transmission from a community in the Pacific Northwest. New Haven Underground, this is Cascadia Base. We're reporting successful implementation of your community integration protocols. Mixed human and partial infected populations are stable and productive. Please advise on winter preparation strategies for underground facilities. Kestra smiled as she prepared her response, knowing that their experimental community was becoming a template for survival across the continent. Each successful integration, each peaceful coexistence between human and post-human populations, represented a step toward a future that none of them could have imagined but all of them were helping to create. Dr. Blackwood's latest research notes lay open on her desk, filled with observations that challenged every assumption about human evolution and adaptation. The plague hadn't been humanity's end, but rather its transformation into something new, something that could survive in a world that had fundamentally changed. Her work now focused on helping that transformation proceed peacefully rather than trying to prevent it. As evening fell over their underground city, the community gathered for their daily briefing and meal. Humans and partially infected sat together, sharing food and conversation that would have been impossible just months before. Children laughed and played while adults discussed expansion plans and resource allocation. The sound of life continuing, adapting, and even thriving echoed through tunnels that had once carried commuters to jobs that no longer existed. Thane looked around the gathering, seeing faces that had become family through shared struggle and mutual dependence. They were no longer the same species that had built the city above them, but they were still human in all the ways that mattered. They loved, they hoped, they protected their young, and they worked together to build something better than what they had lost. The plague had ended one chapter of human history, but it had also begun another. In the tunnels beneath New Haven, in similar communities across the continent, the survivors were writing the first pages of that new chapter. It was a story of adaptation and acceptance, of evolution driven by necessity but guided by the enduring human values of compassion and cooperation. Outside, snow began to fall on the empty streets above, covering the ruins of the old world with a blanket of white that suggested both ending and beginning. Below ground, the community that had learned to bridge the gap between human and post-human continued their quiet work of survival and growth, building tomorrow from the ashes of yesterday. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers that none of them could fully anticipate. But they faced it together, a community that had discovered that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its resistance to change, but its ability to adapt while preserving the connections and values that made survival worthwhile. In the end, they had not just survived the end of the world, they had learned to build a new one,